Everybody loves a good surprise in movies or TV, right?
I am your father.
One of my favorite things to do is look back and you often just see how many hints a scriptwriter and director threw at you all along, but because you were paying attention to everything else, the subtlety was lost, and now you look back, those little hints reveal the movie or TV series was trying to tell you something the whole time.
We've managed to trace the calls. They're coming from inside the car.
And yeah, this of course happens in real life and MMA as well. I'm talking about some of the biggest power plays in the entire sport's history, down to some of the most epic downfalls of a fighter's career. So why don't I just go ahead and show you what I mean? I'm Jason from MMA On Point. A huge shout out to our Hall of Famers. You guys are awesome. These are the 10 most epic foreshadowing moments in MMA history. So then, number 10, the UFC Purchase. Man, I don't know if I was just gullible or what, but when Dana was adamant the UFC wasn't for sale in 2016 and the UFC would continue to be run by the Fertittas for many more years, I kind of believed him. And that's probably because the kind of stuff he said for all the years that he'd been at the helm of the organization.
I'll tell you this, the day we decide to sell, I probably don't want to do this anymore. And listen, me and the Fertitta brothers have been together for a long time. We're very close friends. We work well together. You know, something we did would be a mutual decision, and we'd probably all be looking to get out of it. So,
and you're a private company,
right?
Will you ever go public?
Everybody asked me that question, and I don't think a fight business could be a public company.
Dana clearly never wanted the UFC to be a public company like it is now, with a full-on board of directors and corporate structure. I mean, the guy wears t-shirts everywhere. He's not the most buttoned-up guy.
We don't gotta wear suits. The real men that got money don't gotta wear suits.
And I can relate to that. The point is, him denying the sale was at the very least in line with what he'd been saying for over a decade to this point. But that's not the interesting tidbit of info I want to highlight here. What is the fact that, well, when the UFC landed their first major network TV deal with Fox, for those who don't know that maybe live outside of America, this was a much, much bigger deal than being on Spike TV. There's a very real mainstream exposure when you are airing on the same TV network as the NFL, for starters. And I vividly remember tuning in to watch the announcement press conference. It turned out to be a botched job in a few humorous ways.
To kick things off, I'd like to introduce UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar and UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre.
But going back and watching it now, you might just notice a surprising name suddenly jump out of this Fox exec Dave Hill's mouth.
We first started talking to UFC 10 years ago. I first met Lorenzo and Dana. And I can't let this go without Ari Emanuel, who he and I have been sparring, and I use the term literally, for about a decade about this.
Yeah, dude, this was half a decade before the UFC's sale took place. The fact that during the biggest and most important press conference in the UFC's history, according to Dana White to that point,
there's been a lot of big milestones that we've had over the last 10 years in building this company and growing the sport. But I have to be totally honest when I say that this is the biggest.
And Ari Emanuel's name was mentioned. It shows how big of a player he was before he bought the UFC as part of WME. He was brokering these deals. He was the one getting these massive things done already. And of course, Ari Emanuel also just so happens to be the real-life inspiration behind Entourage's Ari Gold.
That's what actors do. They pretend.
Which, of course, is a bit of foreshadowing of its own, considering it was one of the very first mainstream shows to welcome fighters like Chuck Liddell onto the show in the early years.
You, what are you doing here?
Yeah, so that's worth mentioning. He was guesting on a show that was partially based around someone cosplaying the UFC's future boss, and unfortunately, the reason Chuck Liddell got let go from his cushy desk job. Yeah, they gave him a sweet exec position that definitely did not last when WME took over.
The thing with Chuck and Matt, it was a loyalty thing from me.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It was my gift to them for being the guys
that they were when me, Frank, and Lorenzo, it was our money.
Number 9, The Downfall of a Champion. One of the best MMA shows to ever exist back in the day was one called Inside MMA, and they would do all kinds of great things like going inside famous MMA gyms, breaking down all kinds of fights, having incredibly stacked guest panels, and it was all not to mention co-hosted by Boss Rutan.
Power! Boom, boom into my heart. Ooh, ooh. You sent my soul sky high when your loving starts, but it has nothing to do with the show.
And one such panel included the then very still new to the sport and future champ in Johnny Hendricks. He of course became champion when he defeated Robbie Lawler in 2014, and while this interview was way back in March of 2008, almost 2 years before he'd even debuted with the UFC. So, what happened was a fan sent in a fairly standard question about weight cutting and asking about how it worked. That's when Boss chimed in.
You know, think about it. Your body, 50-70% of your body weight is water. Every system in your body needs water. So if you don't give it water, your kidneys are going to shut down, and that's going to be very painful, let me tell you that. Just take the water and make up with technique. If you lose strength, well, then you got to be technical better and see if you can pull it off then. That's my advice.
Yeah, so clearly he's not a fan of weight cutting, and Johnny Hendricks being on that panel, they decided to ask him what he thought as well.
Yeah, I cut from 97 to 70, so cutting weight's easy though.
But this is where things get interesting, because when it comes back to Boss, he points out some of the more strange techniques fighters do after all that dehydrating to get themselves back in line.
I think it's very dangerous. A lot of them after the fight, after the weigh-in, right away they get an IV. They drink a lot of
Pedialyte.
Pedialyte, you know, what you give to babies who are sick and who just dehydrated. You know, you put a lot of electrolytes in there. It cannot be right. Your body is screaming to recoup because you just trained really, really hard. Your body is recouping from all the hard workout. I say, man, give it what it needs.
Wow. So why is that important, you ask? Well, this is fascinating because one of the most underrated aspects of the downfall of Johnny Hendricks' career was not merely just USADA's drug testing policy. This is a guy who never failed a drug test or had incidents of getting caught with the likes of Vitor or Overeem back in the day, or some of the really obvious ones out there. But one thing he has been extremely vocal about was the fact that USADA notably banned IVs for rehydration as a measure to curb extreme weight cutting.
I think USADA is a great thing for the athletes because it's making people be clean, right? What hurts the MMA aspect of it is that you can't IV back. So I'm a bigger welterweight. I walk around at 210. The IV always brought me back. You know, it helped me get back to life. It helped me get back to where I didn't feel like I cut weight. It just made it that much harder to make weight at 170.
And I'm not saying Hendricks wasn't on something. He might have been. I don't care to speculate one way or the other. But what are some of the most enduring images at the end of his career? It's horribly failed weight cuts, something an IV would absolutely affect. And this is exactly what Boss pointed out without even trying.
I think it's very dangerous. A lot of them after the fight, after the weigh-in, right away they get an IV.
Just how ridiculous extreme weight cutting is, but how reliant some fighters were, and it ended up being exactly what took Hendricks' career down by his own admission.
Cutting weight's easy though.
Number 8. Insane ticket prices. Famously ahead of the Sphere show, the UFC clearly went above what most fans were willing to pay, and some tickets dropped well below even a third of their original asking price. This is something that's been a real pain point for fans in general, even outside of just this one event in recent years, and it's likely only going to increase. You know, outpacing inflation, it definitely is. Why might this be though? Well, interestingly, Dana has never really seemed to be a fan of price gouging. Let's go back to the Fertitta era just around UFC 100 when they had their biggest event ever.
Well, to be honest with you, I've been one of these guys that's kept ticket prices right where we've had them all along. And in some places, we're very conscious on ticket prices. We did UFC 100 at Mandalay Bay. There's only a limited amount of seats there. We could have charged a lot more for tickets. We sold out before we even went on sale. There's no way I was raising those prices. I'm not raising ticket prices. I'm not raising pay-per-view prices.
And I'm not going to do what boxing did and price the fans out of the sport.
Not raising ticket prices like boxing, huh? Boy, have times changed, and keep in mind, UFC 100 is still one of the biggest events the UFC has ever done. To put it this way, if you can imagine Conor never being a part of the situation, I mean, he truly is a unicorn of fight promotion. If he never came into the UFC, Brock Lesnar would still be holding the record today, headlining an event with 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. Only Conor's done more than that. That was 2009, guys. So yeah, the UFC could have charged way more for in-person ticket prices and gotten away with it if they wanted to, like they actually do now today. And of course, I mean relatively for the time, right? And that's what's crazy about how this maps onto now. It's almost word for word what has happened.
And I'm not going to do what boxing did and price the fans out of the sport.
The UFC has been chasing boxing gates. Here's what Steven Espinosa from Showtime,
"You little weasel! Look at you, you little fucking weasel! I can see it in your eyes!"
said, taunting Dana White last year.
The event on Saturday night will generate a gate of over $20 million. But this will be the third time in the last 6 months that we've done a gate of $20 million. To put that in perspective, UFC has never done a gate of $20 million in its entire history. We've done it 3 times since April.
And to be honest, this is a pretty weird thing for somebody to do, promoting a boxing event that has nothing to do with the UFC. I don't know why he's mentioning that, but then again, it probably got the attention that he wanted it to. The irony is that Showtime Boxing would be shutting down by the end of 2023, and of course, Dana had a response to that.
Fuck Espinoza, and it's about time that shitty product is off the air.
But what happened with the Sphere? Sure enough, what Espinoza was taunting him for, a $20 million plus gate, is what was supposed to happen with Conor earlier this year too, but of course he had pulled out of the Chandler fight.
With Conor's return, is that true? Is it going to break 20 million?
Yeah, it's already way over 20 million.
Is it a bit more satisfying? Because I remember there was another promoter in Espinoza who said the UFC's never done a $20 million gate, so is it fun to...
Who gives a flying fuck with Espinoza, thanks.
So this was the first one in UFC history to finally break that $20 million gate at $22 million, even if it was initially projected to be around 25 to 27 before the prices started falling. So going back to this quote,
and I'm not going to do what boxing did and price the fans out of the sport.
Dana literally did everything he said he would never do here. He chased that $20 million gate to try and get back at boxing, who he was saying back then were price gougers, which means he has definitely priced out regular fans. Number 7, the battle for New York. One of the most frustrating things I've ever experienced, and I'm sure many of you will agree if you were watching the sport during that time period, was the bizarre fact that the UFC at one point was actually legal in literally every state with the exception of New York. Of course, including the biggest city in the country, New York City, within that state, could not hold UFC or MMA events at all.
You're through! You hear me? Through! You'll never work in this town again!
And as I mentioned earlier, Inside MMA was just really great back in the day when they covered this in detail. One time, they actually got one of the most prominent opposers of bringing MMA back into New York, Bob Riley. And what's funny is he basically cites corruption as the reason anyone would ever want to support MMA being legalized.
Invariably, I find whoever it is, Mark Ratner, the main lobbyist here for mixed martial arts, McCain, any of the politicians, they are originally against it. But when the money comes in, and they may benefit from that money, then they become for it. And so they sell out for the money.
What I love is when Rogan chimes in.
That guy is a fucking idiot.
He really is.
Moron. That is the dumbest argument, dog fighting and prostitution. I guarantee you this is financial. I guarantee you there are these getting some sort of incentives financially to not sanction MMA in New York, and that's the reason why. They got to dig into that guy's past. There's something creepy going on.
You know what? Next week here on Inside.
And Joe pretty much hits the nail on the head here. While I'm not familiar with Bob Riley, and I don't know if he's ever had any corruption charges or legal issues, he basically told on some of his own colleagues. It was this exact thing that he was accusing MMA people of doing that happened to Sheldon Silver. He was the Speaker of the New York State Assembly who would shoot down the UFC trying to pass a bill every single time it got there. And this lasted until, guess what? he was found to be taking money from various sources fraudulently. I mean, this guy was convicted for taking all kinds of illegal cash in exchange for governmental favorable treatment, one of which allegedly involving the Nevada State Culinary Union, who had it out for the Fertittas and their very much not unionized casinos.
Culinary Union is spending millions of dollars of the guys, all these people who pay dues to keep us out of there. Because my partners, the Fertitta brothers, are the largest non-union gaming company in the country.
So yeah, it was Bob Riley who disliked MMA, said it was money involved in the UFC's New York situation. Just not in the direction he thought it went. And yeah, Rogan pretty much called it. They were telling us the problem all along.
That guy is a fucking idiot.
Number 6, total decimation. At what point does foreshadowing just become outright telling you what's gonna happen?
Don't leave me hanging by a thread. Let me know where I stand.
Because that's exactly what went down when Ben Askren made his infamous foray into the UFC. And man, I don't really know what else to say here about this. Askren was a funny dude, and I kind of miss that element in press conferences these days. And one of his jokes, well, just listen for yourself.
Can you imagine like a 75-year-old Dana? Okay, well, imagine you're smoking a cigar, sitting in your porch 75, thinking, you remember when those guys thought Askren was gonna come here and then I got his ass kicked 3 times? Like, I can just picture that in my head. That's like so funny.
Yeah, this is what happened, down to the T. He fought 3 times in the UFC and just didn't make a great account of himself. I'm totally sympathetic to the reason Herb Dean stopped the Lawler fight, considering his arm did go limp as briefly as it happened. Commentary shouted that he was done as well. I thought that myself watching live on pay-per-view.
We thought he was out by the way his arms were limp.
But it was a mistake, in my opinion.
That's the point. Even in that one fight that he did win, he nearly got flattened by Lawler in the opening seconds. And don't even get me started about the Masvidal one. I mean, that's one of the most infamous KOs in the entire sports history. Just annihilation immediately. And the Damian Maia one was just kind of sad. And Askren just pretty much came out and predicted all this. This pretty much happened with Ronda Rousey too and her head kick.
She's going to try and keep distance and keep far away from me and get me frustrated to a point I'll make a mistake and she can try and kick me in the head, but it's not going to go like that.
And I could talk about more fight predictions, but I want this list to focus on more variety than just fights. This one stood out though because it was basically his whole UFC career and he laid it out in just a few seconds. Number 5, the downfall of Japanese MMA. There is perhaps no greater era in the sport than the Pride era. As time goes on, it becomes more and more mythologized, and it's hard for me as a fan to pull myself out of that. I'm not sure how new fans see it, but it was truly phenomenal. And so when the Yakuza scandal happened and Pride pretty much got blacklisted in all of Japan for being known as a shady business, meaning they couldn't get on TV anymore, that was pretty much curtains for the entire promotion. So when the UFC swooped in to buy their remains, there was little left beyond their rights to their fight library. But this was not the end by any means. Dream had entered the MMA landscape not long after Pride's fall and had become a big success. Naturally so, because in shedding the stigma associated with Pride's name, some of their old execs joined Dream's team, the Dream Team.
Baldy.
So in many ways, it was a literal successor to Pride. The first unofficial event under FEG, Dream's parent company, was Yarinoka, and it even featured Fedor with those trademark blue gloves.
You see Jean-Claude Van Damme and Fedor hugging in the corner there. It's just difficult to move.
Over the years, and as Dream would become a more formalized name, an incredible talent roster came through their ranks with the likes of Krokop, Overeem, Jacare, Musashi, Eddie Alvarez, Mark Hunt, Sakuraba, and most notably for this story, Japanese star Shinya Aoki.
This is an omoplata from the top, and that's it. An omoplata from the top. How about that? That's the first time I see that.
By this point, he was their biggest star and held 2 titles between Dream and even Shudo. And in addition to this, Dream was willing to co-promote with Strikeforce, meaning Nick Diaz was part of their events, and another member of the Scrap Pack, Gilbert Melendez, was available too. And for years, Aoki versus Melendez was close to being set up as one of the best matchups in the world at the time and kept falling through.
What do you want next? Aoki. Give me Shinya Aoki. We were talking about that earlier. Deep in my heart, I've been wanting that fight for a long time. Let's do it, Shinya.
So it was then that Dream partnered with Strikeforce yet again to put this fight on. Dream was holding several events every year at that point, but let's be honest, the whole scene was still bleeding from the Yakuza scandal, so having a big Japanese star was incredibly important for the Japanese market. So going into the Melendez fight, Shinya Aoki said, quote, "It is certain that if I lose, Japan will become a colony of US MMA." This turned out to be sadly prophetic. While I certainly wouldn't call it a colony of the USA, the first half saying that MMA would be over in Japan had some very real teeth to it. And, well, as he did indeed lose to Melendez, the Japanese MMA scene pretty much did implode. This was 2010, and 2011 was the last full calendar year for Dream. They did put on a single New Year's event in 2012, and that was it for the promotion. I love Ryzen, but there were 3 more years before that popped up. I don't think MMA will ever fully die in Japan, of course, but this was as close to dying as I think it can be. And the collapse of its only true international promotion at the time really shows that. All of this was what Shinya foreshadowed himself. Number 4, the last competitor. Over the years, the UFC's definitely had some stiff competition, especially when in the US MMA was effectively banned.
My hat's off to each and every one of these guys that steps in this cage, and to Zuffa, to promoting this sport as a true sport, and not a freak show, not a bunch of thugs, but a very tactical and technical sport.
In Japan, Pride was still on top. I've just covered what happened there, but definitely the strongest competition for the UFC since they began dominating the game was Strikeforce. They easily had the biggest stars outside of the UFC, managed some of the biggest free agent signings ever regardless of promotion.
How you doing, I'm Nick? Pleasure to meet you. How you doing, I'm Nick? Nice to meet you.
And before they sold to Zuffa, well, they, unlike Pride, were actually in their best health as an organization. What essentially happened is that they were owned by a few investors who had a simple goal in mind: profit off of their investment. That is exactly what a sale to the UFC instantly gave them, a return on that investment.
But if you're Silicon Valley Sports and Entertainment, you can multiply your investment by 2.5x right now and walk away. And so the investors said, yes, we'll do that, because these guys are not. Only Scott Coker's attached to MMA. He's the only one that really wants to be there. The rest just saw an investment opportunity. And so for them, it was a no-brainer. We've been in the space for 18 months, and now we're going to walk away at 2.5x what we put in. That's a great investment. We're out of here. But I don't think they're kicking themselves. Those guys don't. They just move on to the next venture. They're venture capitalists. We made our money, move on to the next thing.
This is something almost nobody saw coming. I vividly remember checking MMA Fighting the day of their sale and seeing the interview with Ariel and Dana White, and it was a complete shock, seemingly out of nowhere.
UFC has purchased Strikeforce. Is that true?
That is true.
When did this become official?
It's literally official right now. It literally just closed the deal.
Turns out the breadcrumbs were there all along, and through Scott Coker himself. What happened is, while speaking to Ariel Helwani on his YouTube channel, the one that's just been rebranded to the Ariel Helwani Show, Scott Coker was in the middle of their interview recapping Dan Henderson versus Babalu 2 in December of 2010. That's when Coker very abruptly changed the subject.
Let's say one thing, guys. Strikeforce finished out with a great year, and keep supporting Showtime. Thank you, Ken Hirschman, for giving us the opportunity, because this has been something that's been a dream to have these big fights, and I feel like we're very grateful to have you continue to support Strikeforce.
Yeah. So who is Ken Hirschman that he's talking about here? Well, he was the top exec behind Showtime Sports and was responsible for putting Strikeforce on the air. Now, I certainly don't want to hyperbolize any of this here. It's not that crazy to thank the head of Showtime during your interview. But what makes this extra compelling is, A, he'd never done this before or since, and B, guess what Lorenzo Fertitta said about when the UFC started getting into talks with Strikeforce?
When did your guys' first serious discussions start taking place?
When was that? January? December.
Yeah, this is the same month that he was doing this interview with Ariel Helwani. And I think you can read between the lines that Scott Coker in this very abrupt message to Hirschman was winking and nodding at Showtime and Hirschman not to give up on Strikeforce as the sale was imminent. It was Scott Coker's appeal to keeping the dream going. And whether that message was meant for us and it was coded for someone else, we can look back at it now and see the foreshadowing or the writing on the wall. Number 3, GOAT versus GOAT. This little bit of MMA lore has become quite infamous in recent years, and yeah, we are perhaps talking about the greatest career accomplishments in the entire sport's history. But it's always been marred by controversy to such an extent that many disregard his standing in the GOAT discussion entirely. Of course, I'm talking about Jon Jones, and this moment goes way back to the very first time he won a championship against Shogun in March of 2011. Jones notably came out with his crazy story about defending a woman from robbers literally the same day he won that first title.
I see an old Spanish couple like screaming. And I'm like, dude, they just got mugged. So Mike Winkeljohn hops out of the car and he's like, you guys okay? And then she's like, he just broke my window open and he took all my stuff and he's running. And I tell our driver, I'm like, dude, take care of my stuff. I throw it on the floor and I just start running. And one of his behind feet, I just kicked him from the back, like kind of kicked his ankle out. And he fell down, and when he fell, he like, scraped his hands up pretty good. We hold him and the police come. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. And the lady, she came, she's like, oh, it's so good to see people like you guys here to help me. You guys cared enough to chase that guy. God's gonna be with you tonight, man. You're gonna do good. God bless you, son. I'm gonna watch your fight. And I was like, thank you, man. It was crazy. It was good.
And now, well, he's unfortunately known for kind of the opposite, himself being the bad guy in breaking a pregnant woman's arm in a drug-fueled car crash, and a litany of other legal issues. But that night when he won the title over Shogun for the first time, he was still just 23 years old, which by today's standards, even still holds the UFC record for the youngest champion ever. And to that point, you certainly only saw the fresh-faced preacher's kid who had done no wrong, with few hints as to what was to come.
In my opinion, not only is he the #1 light heavyweight in the world, he just shot right up in the pound for pound.
And it was after this first title fight, Dana White said this.
But this is where the real challenge begins. Every scumbag, dirtball, what I call Klingons, all the Klingons, the barnacles, they're probably trying to glom onto him right now as he's trying to walk to his car and go back to the hotel. He seems to be a grounded kid, smart guy, has a good family around him and people that, care about him. So hopefully he can get through the nastiness that's going to come at him.
Wow, pretty much exactly the path Jones's career has gone down. Everything Dana was warning against has happened. As a quick bonus here, I do think it's important to note that before Ngannou left and Dana was attacking Jones for wanting to quote-unquote get Wilder money.
Told my lawyer he wants what Deontay Wilder was paid. The guy's made a lot of money. Made a lot of money. If you look at Jon Jones' track record, show me somebody that has the track record this guy has and has made the money that Jon Jones has made.
He was even then still calling him the greatest of all time. So I do think his appeals to calling Jones the greatest have been genuine in recent years.
And it's not like I'm out here on some smash Jon Jones crusade. I like Jon. I'm the one actually saying there is no debate. There is no argument. He's the GOAT. Guy's gone undefeated. He's fought everybody. He's fought all the best in the world, despite what he's been doing to himself outside of the octagon.
I really don't think he's saying that just because Ngannou's gone if he was doing it when they were clearly on awful terms. Is he right about calling him the pound for pound though? No, that's totally different from the GOAT discussion. Pound for pound is an active ranking and he's only fought once in 4 years. We'll see if that changes or if he just retires. Number 2, is this actually funny? I think one thing I've definitely done over the years that I'm starting to feel more conflicted about the more and more I look into it is make fun of Tito for saying obviously nonsensical things.
I don't think there's anybody in this business that does better than me. Yeah. Maybe, was it Gregor McConnor or Conor McGregor?
I'm far from old. I mean, I'm 34 years old, 34 years young.
He's reaching for those grapes. He's trying to make his wine, and the wine's already sounding like a violin with that cheese and wine.
Even as I'm talking about this, it's hard for me not to laugh at these clips, but the reality is, man, he wasn't always like this, guys. especially if you go back to the early 2000s. He actually used to be fairly quick with his responses. How about this? I'll show you a couple clips. Sorry for the bad quality. You gotta love these old videos, but how about after looking at those, we'll compare them to the past few years, and you can tell me what you think. Here's the old stuff.
At least you went, I'm gonna take your soul. That's good. At least you didn't have to go to Wizard of Oz to get some courage there, little lion. Yeah. When this lion steps all over your ass.
If you beat Ken Shamrock, are you gonna do the gravedigger thing and the burying thing?
I don't know. I may drag him in the middle of the octagon. You never know. I'm gonna look down at him and I'm gonna show him no respect like he has nobody else. That's right. I hope you have Vince McMahon's number, because I think he'd be looking for a job after this one. Vince McMahon.
I visualize my match before it even happens. I'll visualize walking down the ramp. I'll visualize bouncing in the corner. I get really, really emotional before the fight, and I throw up. I don't know what the reason. I think it's just my nerves. And right before the fight, it seems like every single time I always cry. That's one thing I always do. I get really emotional and I cry. When I first fought, was in 1997, May 30th. I fought for free. First UFC I fought, UFC 13, I fought for free. Just to compete, man. I wanted to see how tough I really was and if I could really make it in this mixed martial art game. As years went on, the motivation and the focus changed. My beautiful son, of course, little Jacob. And I just wanted to make sure that he had a future. Being from a broken home and from a poor family, you want to make sure your kid has everything in the world, and that's want to make sure that he has everything. All you can do is follow the right hand. We'll go bing, bing. Exactly. Now, another thing important too is breathing when you hit. You don't want to hold your breath. All right. You do exactly the same thing with the arm lock. All I'm doing is popping your capsule and dislocating your arm here.
Oh, got it.
And what are you going to do?
Scream?
No.
Try?
We went over this once.
Hit you in the balls.
I'm going to squeeze you.
Squeeze. Okay. Tap. That's
there you go. Good.
What do you call this? What's the official name for this position?
I don't know. This is your idea, man.
And here's the new stuff.
I train 6 days a week, 5 days a week. I'll train 3 days a week. One of those days I will train 2 days of the week. So 6 days a week I'll be training.
I'm faster, I'm stronger, I'm younger.
I want to outlive my children. Of course, 100%.
I mean, guys, this is a clearly different person from those earlier videos. And I'm not saying he was always super sharp. He definitely had gaffes back in the day, too.
I'm more on the role-playing games. Really? Like Metal Gear. Real good. Silent Hill, Resident Evil. Games like that, I sit alone and play by myself at night and scare myself playing.
But there's still a massive difference, and it's hard not to see where I'm going with this. The obvious logical reason for why is that it's brain damage, or CTE, from all those years he's had in fighting. Nam Pham, a former UFC fighter as well, has tragically gone viral for this in recent months as his speech has become incredibly compromised. And so where is all the foreshadowing on all this? Well, I came across an incredibly heated post-fight press conference between Tito and Dana White just after Tito did that Dana White is my bitch shirt thing at UFC 84 in 2008, and afterwards he had this to say.
I don't want to be 45 years old competing in the UFC. I don't want to be doing a 20-year span of murder myself trying to make $1 million.
At that age, we shouldn't be fighting. We should have been taken care of before that we have nothing to worry about. UFC are not going to go out of their box. We'll be huge and push the brand, and when fighters try to speak out, we'll smash them.
Sad to say it, but an even worse version of what he foreshadowed happened. He was 33 here, and as of this recording, he is now 49. His most recent MMA fight was at the age of 44, but he was still getting KO'd by Anderson Silva at the age of 46 in boxing, and unlike his nightmare scenario of being in the UFC till 45, well, he did it in lower leagues, likely making fairly decent paydays, but nowhere near the heights of this time period. And it's hard to deny the mental decline that's taken place. I'm not saying the UFC or anyone else forced him into this, nor other people like him. It was just as much his decision.
Yeah, I'll continue to box. I still want to box. I'd love to box. I'm just learning. It's an experience. I'm not a boxer, I'm a wrestler.
So few retire inside or outside the UFC once their better years have clearly passed them by, and that's regardless of pay or the combat sport that they're in. Hell, how old is Mike Tyson now fighting Jake Paul? It's obviously very hard for people to give up on these identities that they've established their entire lives around. But either way, Tito essentially predicted everything that has happened at that press conference way back in 2008. Number 1, world domination. Well, I guess we'll end on a slightly more positive note. If you haven't seen this image before, it's because it's from an old tweet that the UFC deleted way back in 2013. This was supposedly from a Fighter Summit presentation that they had with their athletes to talk about the vision of the UFC moving forward, and as they were starting to scale up their yearly events massively with Fox, this still being in their early years. For scale, in 2013 when this happened, they were doing 33 events, and by the next year in 2014, they did 46 events. So back to this photo. World fucking domination. It was all a bit of tongue-in-cheek joking around with their team, and it certainly is not true of now. I think soccer, or football as it's known around the world, is by far the biggest worldwide sport still. It certainly has not surpassed the NFL or NBA in America. So yeah, not exactly the most accurate prediction, even if it was just meant as a joke. So how in the world is this supposed to be foreshadowing? Well, I don't think it was intentional, but at one point, this literally did come true in a way you would never think. There was this little thing in 2020 called the coronavirus, and what ended up happening? Well, for a while, the UFC was the only sport going, and there was no soccer, no NFL, no MLB, no NBA, no NHL, whatever initialism you can think of. It was all shut down, and this was the only thing going, the UFC. So whether they had this in mind or not, it did very ironically come true, and to the UFC's credit, the risks that they took that year absolutely surged them ahead for a ton of new fans stuck at home that just wanted anything in the world to watch. I'm sure many of you watching this video now literally became fans for the first time, or at least dove in a lot deeper during that time. And that's one of the things I do love about this sport. You truly can't predict what's going to happen inside or outside the cage. And this is a very literal example coming true, but it taking shape through the pandemic is just fucking wild. Alright guys, I'll keep it brief in my sign off here. Thank you all for watching. A big shout out to our Hall of Famers for making videos like this possible. Consider joining if you're interested, and we'll catch you on the next one. Peace.